Alright guys, so we have yet another shocking and yet somehow unsurprising story here from The Intercept's Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill exposing the deep pro-Israel bias of the US mainstream media. Specifically, this is focusing on the New York Times, but of course we know that this kind of a story applies to most mainstream media outlets here. So the headline is, Leaked New York Times Gaza Memo Tells Journalists to Avoid Words Like Genocide, Ethnic Cleansing, and Occupied Territory. Amid the internal battle over the New York Times coverage of Israel's war, top editors handed down a set of directives. So the headline doesn't even do it justice. This is even more ridiculous than what you guys are expecting. They say, the New York Times instructed journalists covering Israel's war on the Gaza Strip to restrict the use of terms like genocide, ethnic cleansing, and to avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land, according to a copy of an internal memo obtained by The Intercept. The memo also instructs reporters not to use the word Palestine, except in very rare cases, and to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by displaced Palestinians or refugees expelled from other parts of Palestine during previous Israeli-Arab wars. And a massive chunk of the population of Gaza either directly or are directly descendants of people who were expelled and became refugees and were forced into what is now the Gaza Strip. They say the areas are recognized by the United Nations as refugee camps and house hundreds of thousands of registered refugees. The memo, written by Times Standards editor Susan Westling, international editor Philip Pan, and their deputies, quote, offers guidance about some terms and other issues we have grappled with since the start of the conflict in October. While the document is presented as an outline for maintaining objective journalistic principles in reporting on the Gaza war, several Times staffers told The Intercept that some of its contents show evidence of the paper's deference to Israeli narratives. Yes, 100%, to say the least. I mean, first off, this statement right here, that this memo is offering guidance about some terms and other issues we've grappled with since the start of the conflict in October, the words that you're telling your reporters to avoid using up here, like, well, genocide applies to what's happening in Gaza now, but ethnic cleansing and occupied territory and Palestine, these are not things that began on October 7th. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians has been going on for decades. The occupation of Palestinians, the forcing of Palestinians into refugee status, that has been going on for decades. So maybe your first issue is that it seems like the New York Times, upper echelon, their leadership, seems to believe that this all just randomly started on October 7th. If you are not willing to use the words ethnic cleansing and occupied territory, which are widely recognized as very clearly defined standards under international law, if you can't use that as terminology, then you are not going to be able to accurately and informatively cover what's currently happening. You can't cover October 7th onwards in a vacuum. Now, even when you are covering what's happened since October 7th, you shouldn't throw around the word genocide, but if Israel, according to the ICJ, is plausibly committing a genocide, then it's not something you should just avoid using as a word, okay? And in your coverage since October 7th, we also know you haven't exactly been fair and balanced, okay? In covering Israel's relentless massacre of innocent men, women, and children. Haven't exactly been, fair and balanced in that specific piece of the coverage. So, I mean, Jesus Christ, not using the word Palestine, it's almost comically absurd. It's genuinely hard to believe at this point. Well, it's not hard to believe if you've been keeping up with the New York Times coverage of this, but, I mean, still, not using the word Palestine. What the fuck is up with that? Now, apparently, this was also pointed out here by Abdullah, the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan here. And apparently, this is also a standard that applies to the White House, because here's Karine Jean-Pierre, one of Biden's top spokespeople, who's dancing around trying to also avoid using the word Palestine. So let's watch this real quick.
We also need to make sure that we have those conversations with Israel on protecting innocent lives in Palestine, in the Palestinian lives in Gaza. We need to get all important humanitarian aid into Gaza to the innocent people of Palestinian people, to make sure that they have what they need, whether it's food, whether...
What is going on here? I mean, I'll tell you guys what's going on here. What's happening is that both the U.S. government, clearly from what we just watched from Karine Jean-Pierre and the Biden administration, but also the New York Times and broadly the U.S. mainstream media, as well as the Israeli government, they do not want to recognize Palestine as an actual place, okay? Because in order to recognize Palestine, even as a state, which, by the way, as a reminder here, guys, a vast majority of the countries around the world, and this is going to become relevant as we get further into this piece, recognize Palestine as a state. Even the UN recognizes them not as a full member of the United Nations, but Palestine has a state representative at the United Nations. Again, a majority of the countries around the world recognize Palestine. It's a select few countries, including the United States, Israel, obviously, other Western governments, that are unwilling to recognize Palestine. The reason for this, the reason of their dancing around the word, is because recognizing the state of Palestine, which the U.S. could do at any moment that they want, would mean that the illegal occupation, which apparently the New York Times is also not willing to use that phrase, but the illegal occupation, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, becomes that much more officially illegal under international law, and much more officially recognized as a crime against humanity. If you admit that Palestinians are a real people and that Palestine is a real place, then what Israel is doing in that place comes that much more to the surface. And so essentially what you have from the Biden administration and from the New York Times, by not using or avoiding the word Palestine, is them just straight up doing Israeli propaganda. That's what they're doing. They're trying to delegitimize the Palestinian people. And so they continue. They say, quote, issuing guidance like this to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance in how we cover the news is standard practice. This is Charlie Statlander, a Times spokesperson. He says, across all of our reporting, including complex events like this, we take care to ensure our language choices are sensitive, current, and clear to our audience. We'll circle back around to this here in a second. I'll give you guys some examples. They say issues over style guidance have been among a bevy of internal rifts at the Times over its Gaza coverage. In January, The Intercept reported on a disputes at the Times newsroom over issues with an investigative story on systematic sexual violence on October 7th. The leak gave rise to a highly unusual internal probe, and the company faced harsh criticism for allegedly targeting Times workers of the Middle East and North African descent, which the Times brass denied, of course. And on Monday, this past Monday, executive editor Joe Kahn told the staff that the leak investigation had been concluded unsuccessfully. So this part of it, and I talked about this on the channel weeks ago at this point, there was a leak involving the daily podcast that the New York Times puts out, where they were trying to basically cover a New York Times piece that they posted about the systemic or alleged systemic weaponization of sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th. The piece was widely debunked, okay? Massive holes in it, the sourcing was terrible, all of this and that, okay? So we've talked about all of that. Then the Daily, the podcast, tries to do an episode covering basically the same subject matter as that original article that was widely debunked. And the Daily basically couldn't put out this podcast because in order to do so, they would have to fact check the original piece, and they couldn't do that. They found all of these errors. So they decided to basically scrap the entire thing. And then after all of this information about that internal fight at the New York Times came out, instead of addressing the issues with the original report, which by the way is still up, they have not retracted the original debunked report, but instead of addressing that or addressing flaws at the New York Times or their bias, they launched this massive targeted harassment campaign of their own staff, specifically singling out, as they point out here, those of Middle East and North African descent, so racially profiling their own staff to try to figure out who the leaker was, and then they concluded this unsuccessfully. This is the New York Times. This is the so-called paper of record here in the United States. This is what's actually going on behind the scenes. Now, as I highlighted up here, current and clear to our audiences, right? That's the goal of using the kind of language or avoiding the kind of language that they point out in this article. They say it's because they want to make sure that they're sensitive, current, and clear to their audience. So let's look at a little bit of this, right? So here's a couple of examples that were pointed out here by us all on Twitter. So this was a headline on Russia and Ukraine. The headline is How Russia is Using Ukrainians' Hunger as a Weapon of War. This is a very good headline. It's a very clear headline, as she points out here. You're pointing out who's doing this and what is the crime. Okay, it's Russia doing it, and the crime is that they are weaponizing starvation, weaponizing hunger or food, right? And so we move on to a couple other examples. So here's one. Gazans describe search for food and wonder if it will get worse. I mean, as she points out here, Gazans, again, you can see the avoidance of the term Palestinians, but Gazans describe search for food. So what's going on here? If you were to just read the headline here, right, and typically, obviously, I would advise people read the entire article instead of just looking at the headlines, but the fact of the matter is, many people, if not most people, do just read the headlines. They see the headlines, and they get a sense of what's actually going on from that. And so if you were to read this headline in a vacuum, what exactly would you take away from this? Gazans describe search for food and wonder if it will get worse. This doesn't tell you anything about why there's a search for food. What's going on here? I mean, the headline would more accurately be something like, Palestinians in Gaza describe starving amidst Israel's weaponization of war, or weaponization of food as a tool of war, right? Or intentional blockading of aid from getting into Gaza. I mean, similar to the first headline that we just watched there. But they use this vague nonsense language, dancing around it. Search for food and wonder if it will get worse. Another one. To battle wartime hunger, Gazans turn to a humble, leafy green. These are real fucking headlines, guys. You have the Israeli government imposing a 6-month siege on the people of Gaza to the point now where countless Palestinians at this point have been either on the verge or have already starved to death because Israel is blocking the aid from getting in as they bomb them into oblivion. And then also in many instances, as we've covered with the WCK strike and the other strikes as well, have bombed aid workers, aid convoys, and people who are trying to go and get the aid. And with all of that happening, they describe this as if it's like some sort of a tale, as if it's some sort of like a fairy tale or something. To battle wartime hunger, Gazans turn to a humble leafy green. What in the fuck does that mean? I mean, seriously, guys. They would have you believe that, like, the hunger in Gaza is just a product of war, right? That it's not due to Israel intentionally blocking aid from getting in. So there's a couple examples. This was another one that I almost didn't believe, because I actually went out of my way to, I checked these headlines, and then I went back and I was looking for how did the New York Times cover the strike on the Palestinians who were going to try to get the aid from the convoy that came in just back in March, early March, right? And they ended up killing about 100 civilians in that and injuring like 700 Palestinians, okay? Just a complete brazen war crime that they then lied about and tried to cover up. This is how the New York Times reported on it, guys. Middle East crisis. Disastrous convoy was part of new Israeli effort to hand out more aid in Gaza. They covered a story where, after months of blockading aid from getting into Gaza and intentionally starving the Palestinian population in Gaza, and then massacring the people who went to try to get the aid that they were allowing in, this trickle of aid, they covered that situation. 100 people dead, 700 injured, and they basically are trying to portray this as if this is actually an indication that Israel is desperately trying to give more aid to Palestinians. A disastrous convoy. It wasn't a disastrous convoy. It was a fucking war crime. They massacred starving people who were desperately trying to go and get aid. They massacred them by the dozens. And this is how they cover it. And you know, again, it's shocking, but it's not surprising. We've seen previous reports like this. This was also from The Intercept a couple of months ago. I don't know how long ago it was at this point. But they were tracking. I mean, this is October 7th to November 25th. The mentions of Palestinians, as you can see going down here, as the number of Palestinians who have been killed is actually going up. So as more Palestinians are killed, they're covering them less. Okay? And then also the use of words, right? Slaughter, horrific, massacre. The blue line is when they're talking about Israelis on October 7th, and the green is when they're talking about Palestinians. So you can't even make an argument that, oh, we're just trying to be neutral, because you're not being neutral. You're using loaded terms like slaughter and horrific and massacre. You're using those when it comes to Israelis, but then when it comes to Palestinians, I mean, there's almost no examples of this. I mean, this one is like 120-4 ratio of mentions for the use of the word massacre, right? And this is covering the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. So again, this crosses multiple different outlets. And so they continue down here. They say, despite the memo's framing as an effort to not employ incendiary language to describe killings on all sides in the Times reporting on the Gaza war, such language has been used repeatedly to describe attacks against Israelis by Palestinians, and almost never in the reverse, which is exactly those, different graphs that I was just showing you guys. Now we'll finish off with this. Touchy debates. The Times memo touches on some of the most highly charged and disputed language around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The guidance spells out, for instance, usage of the word terrorist, which The Intercept previously reported was at the center of one of their internal debates. They say, quote, "It is accurate to use terrorism and terrorist in describing the attacks of October 7th, which included the deliberate targeting of civilians and killings and kidnappings, according to this memo. We should not shy away from that description of the events or attackers, particularly when we provide context and explanation." So they're saying when it comes to October 7th, when it comes to Hamas, it's okay to use the word terrorism or terrorist attack because they killed innocent civilians. So what about Israel? So they say the guidance also instructs journalists to avoid fighters when referring to the October 7th attack. The term suggests a conventional war rather than a deliberate attack on civilians, and be cautious in using militants, which is interpreted in different ways and may be confusing to readers. So again, the same point. Now they say the Times does not characterize Israel's repeated attacks on Palestinian civilians as terrorism, even when civilians have been targeted. This is also true of Israel's assaults on protected civilian sites, including hospitals. So it's very cut and dry. Yeah, when Hamas kills civilians or kidnaps civilians, they're terrorists. That's a terrorist attack. When Israel kills civilians at a greater percentage than what happened on October 7th and at a much greater scale than what happened on October 7th, that's not terrorism. That's self-defense, okay? You see the dichotomy here. They say, on the term Palestine, a widely used name for both the territory and the UN-recognized state, the Times memo contains blunt instructions. Do not use in datelines, routine text, or headlines, except in very rare cases, such as when the United Nations General Assembly elevated Palestine to a non-member observer state or references to historic Palestine. I mean, and they say this is very similar to the Associated Press style book or guidance for their own reporters. So what exactly are they saying? They're saying you can't use the word Palestine unless you are explicitly referring to the use of that term in the United Nations General Assembly or historic Palestine. So you can reference in some specific cases historic Palestine, but you can't reference current Palestine? What the fuck is going on here? Again, this is just IDF propaganda. This is Israeli government propaganda to not use the term Palestine, as if it's just like a made-up fictional place. The memo directs journalists not to use the phrase refugee camps, again, to describe the long-standing refugee settlements in Gaza. Quote, while termed refugee camps, the refugee centers in Gaza are developed in densely populated neighborhoods dating back to the 1948 war. Refer to them as neighborhoods or areas, and if further context is necessary, explain how they have historically been called refugee camps. I mean, yeah, you may call them neighborhoods or areas. That doesn't take away from the fact that under international law, according to the United Nations, that these are refugees. This is why, by the way, the Israeli military and the Israeli government, and the United States, by the way, have been going after UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is because this is an agency that is specifically intended to help assist with Palestinian refugees. So the existence of UNRWA is a thorn in the side of Israel, because it is an acknowledgement of the 1948 Nakba. It is an acknowledgement of the systematic, decades-long dispossession of Palestinians from their land. And so that's why they call UNRWA Hamas. That's why the United States is trying to gut funding to UNRWA, is for that exact reason. And essentially you have the New York Times here saying, we're just going to go along with that exact same line and not acknowledge the refugee status recognized under international law of many of these Palestinians. The memo's instructions on the use of occupied territory says, when possible, avoid the term and be specific, Gaza or the West Bank, as each has a slightly different status. Okay, that's true, but it's still also true and accurate and fair and balanced to say it's the occupied West Bank, because it's fucking occupied. Or even the occupied Gaza Strip, because it has been effectively occupied. 17 years of blockade from Israel. They control everything that gets in and out of Gaza. To not call that an occupation is dishonest. It's not fair. It's not balanced. It's not accurate. It's misleading. They say the United Nations, along with much of the world, considers Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem to be occupied Palestinian territories seized in 1967. And we finish off with this quote. This is from one of the sources from the New York Times that The Intercept talked to. They said, "You are basically taking the occupation out of the coverage, which is the actual core of the conflict. It's like, oh, let's not say occupation because it might make it look like we're justifying a terrorist attack." And that's basically my main takeaway from this as well, which is that if you try to remove ethnic cleansing or apartheid or genocide or occupation or refugee camps from this conversation, you are never going to be accurately reporting on it. And that's the fundamental question here, is like, what is the job of a journalist? What is the job of a news outlet like the New York Times? The job is not to be neutral, okay? It's not to be neutral in the sense that regardless of what the claims are, we're going to give equal weight to either side. Or in this case, you're giving significantly more weight to the Israeli side over not only the Palestinian side, but also international law, the United Nations, human rights organizations. So you're giving significant deference to Israel. But even if it was a different issue, right? The job of a journalist, if you're having a debate or you're covering an issue like climate change, and you have fossil fuel corporations who are saying, climate change, not really that big of a deal. Well, we'll figure it out over time. Let's keep pumping the fossil fuels. And then on the other side, you have a whole bunch of climate scientists who are saying we need to aggressively transition away from fossil fuels and to renewable clean energy, or else these are going to be the consequences. Your job as a journalist is not to look at both of those claims and say, well, the fossil fuel executives say this and climate scientists say this. Your job is to report what is the truth, what is backed by the evidence. Okay? That's actual journalism, is getting to the truth, not getting to be neutral between two sides, regardless of what the sides are. It's being as accurate and informative and giving full context whenever you can on any given issue. And the New York Times, as well as many other mainstream media outlets, are objective failures at this.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying